I'm in need of a quick and easy instant gratification project. Hello and welcome, I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making a 1940s hat. The late 1930s and early 1940s is a really experimental time in millinery, and it's also a great era to get into if you are fairly new to millinery or you haven't done any millinery, because it doesn't require a lot of millinery knowledge per se. It is a lot of just throwing random things on your head. There's a lot of knitting patterns, crocheting patterns, sewing patterns from this era, and there's so wild experimentation going on that even if it is a high-end like designer piece, they often have a lot of like homemade elements to them. For a little bit of context, for most part of the 1920s and the first few years of the 30s, the gloche hat dominated hat fashion. And then, because there was basically just one style of fashionable hat for so long, people got sick and tired of that one hat. So they went the complete opposite direction next and just went absolutely wild with hat fashion. There was so many different options. A lot of them were inspired by menswear, but then they just went wild from there. And then there was so many different kinds of experimental shapes, and like they did even like shoes for hats. They did all kinds of ridiculous, avant-garde, crazy things with hats. And that's why it was so interesting to be in millinery at this time. But on top of that, because there had been that simple hat style for a very long time, so a lot of people had gotten used to the idea of making their own hats to save in the cost of, clothing and millinery, especially during the Great Depression. So when these wild avant-garde hats came, a lot of women had been making already hats, and they were like, well, I can do that. And they came up with their own. As fun and interesting as this era is in hats, that do-it-yourself mentality of this era kind of led to the downfall of the millinery trade and eventually the downfall of the hat, unfortunately. But the hat we're doing this time is basically this little tilt hat that comes in the front, and then it has little drapey bits. There's several different variations of this from the era. Unfortunately, most of those are not in the public domain, so I can't really show you a lot of the variations, but I'll link my Pinterest down below, and they have a ton of different examples so that you can go through them and look and see what kind of variations there are and what you would personally prefer to make. But one of the key features of this type of tilt hat that keeps on coming over and over and over again is that a lot of them seem to have basically a ring part. There's also knitting patterns for this and crocheting patterns. Some have a full disc, and there's also a lot of felt hats that go with the same idea. But basically it forms a disc on the top, and then there is some sort of veil or drapery bit. Sometimes it covers a lot more of the face, sometimes a lot less. Sometimes it basically forms a snood part in the back to hold your hair. Like I said, there's a lot of variation in this, and you can kind of go wild with it. I'm going to go for kind of a film noir based inspired look, where there is going to be a bit more drapery that I can also like wrap around my neck for a more dramatic flair, and also that is excellent wind protection in the cold. In the simplest form, this hat basically just consists of a ring portion that is often stuffed with something, and then the drapey fabric bit. The easiest way to figure out how big you want the ring portion is to take a tape measure and then form it into a ring. Here, for instance, is a 16-inch ring. And then just try it on your head and see what the size looks like. I think this looks decent. It's not huge, but maybe it's a little small for me. So let's go for an 18-inch ring. Now this I could still do, but I feel that that is maybe a little bit bigger than I really want the tilt, especially because then I won't be having this huge bun on the top. I'll have my hair further in the back. So I think I'll go with a 17-inch ring. Yeah, this is the size I'll go with, but you can measure however big you want the ring. And then, because I want to see how big I want the roll to be stuffed, then I just basically take my tape measure and just look. I think a 4-inch roll is kind of small. That isn't going to give much height. So I think I'll go with a 5 or... yeah, I think even a 5.5-inch roll. Like that, I think that gives it a nice height. So that's what I'll aim for. So I'll give myself a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on both sides. So then I will cut my piece 17 inches with seam allowance on both ends. So then I'll make that 18 inches, and then I'll long, and then 6.5 inches wide. That will give me a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both ends, so that there's plenty of room in case I want to still fiddle around with it. You can make this out of any sort of fabric scraps you have laying around. Wool especially is really good because it gives you a nice grip and gives you a nice texture, especially if you have something like a crepe wool or something with a little bit of texture. It will give it an interesting look. But you can also knit this piece or crochet this piece, or you can even use scrap silk if you want. Scrap rayon pieces are also really excellent. Depending on how big you're going to make the drapey snood piece, you can get away with using very small scraps. Or if you're buying fabric, I would buy 1/2 yard just to be safe. Then you have plenty of fabric to play around with. As for the filling, you can use whatever polyfill or wool roving, whatever you happen to have lying around, or even just fabric scraps and cabbage. And especially like the little bits of thread that come off a serger, those are excellent stuffing for this. This type of hats were extremely fashionable from the late 1930s all the way to the end of the 1940s, but especially during the war years, because it's a hat that requires very little pieces of fabric, so it fits very well with the make, do, and mend mentality. You can also use like worn out pieces of clothing that, like a skirt, for instance, that doesn't have enough fabric to be used as clothing anymore. It can still make a really nice hat because you can work around the pieces, you can piece it to use the pieces that aren't worn out or don't have any fade on them. Or even you can use the faded bits for different sort of effects. I'm going to make first the ring for the hat, the tilt part, and then I'm going to worry about the drapey fabric that goes underneath later, once I've finished the ring. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that out and sew it, and then we'll figure out the rest. After cutting that 18 by 6.5 inch piece, fold it in half lengthwise and sew along the one short edge and the long edge. This creates your tube for stuffing. Next, take your tube and turn it inside out. There's no need to clip the corners in this one because you don't need those corners sharp because it will be covered by the fabric from the other side of the tube. Once you've turned it, fill it with stuffing of your choice. How full you fill it is all up to you. It depends on whether or not you want it really stuffed and hard, or if you want it softer and more drapey. If you're using a more unconventional filling like I am, I would recommend rolling it like this to make sure that you get it stuffed pretty evenly so that there aren't any weird lumps and bumps in it. Once you get it to where you want it, you want to turn those raw edges from that open end to the inside and pin in place to make it easier to connect it into a round circle. Once you're done pinning, shove that sewn in end inside the pinned end, and then readjust the pins so that it holds both that circle in place and those raw edges in. And next comes the hand sewing bit. Remember to always wax your thread so that it doesn't tangle. I use a hem stitch to connect the circle. To figure out the drapey bit, I take my scrap piece of fabric and pin it onto my mannequin head. Then with a hat ring placed over top of it, I drape the fabric how I want it inside the ring, and then I cut the fabric in the right angle. If there is a certain way you want the fabric to lay on you, remember to always move the fabric in that direction so that it will then lay the proper way once it's on your head. So for instance, if you want it to wrap around your neck like I do, then you want to wrap it around the mannequin's neck while you're doing this to make sure that you have enough length. Next, you're going to want to do a rolled hem on all the raw edges of that drapery piece. And once you've hemmed all the raw edges, then you want to take that drapery piece and pin it back onto the hat roll. And then we're going to sew that drapery onto that hat. This doesn't need to be super neat and nice stitches. You can just use a big ass whip stitch. As long as it holds the fabrics together, that's the main important part. For the back portion where the drapery falls down, I use a big back stitch. And now the hat is finished. To wear it, you just tilt it on your head into the angle you want it to be in. This will very much depend on how you've styled your hair. And to secure it, you'll need a hat pin. If you don't happen to have a hat pin, you can also use a safety pin on the inside of the hat and secure it with a hairpin through that safety pin and your hair. To secure the hat with the hat pin, you push it through the hat and through your hair, and then out from the other side of the hat, making sure that it has grabbed properly the hair in between so that then it will stay in place. Now that drapey bit can be left to hang in the back, or it can be draped around the face, or it could be draped around the hair to form a kind of snood. You can change it up according to your mood. I personally love this avant-garde draped around the neck, kind of film noir baddie look. All in all, this project took only a few hours to make, so it definitely was a fast and easy instant gratification project. I chose to style it with an early 1940s original vintage dress and dark green strappy shoes and a purse. All original vintage pieces from my collection. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you haven't already subscribed and you'd like to do that, feel free to do that. And if you enjoyed this, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this universe. And I hope to see you again next time. Bye!